the Chittering dark. The metal walls of the prisoner transport rattled with every jolt and shudder of its worn old suspension. The outer frame groaned like the ribs of some great beast that had swallowed them all whole as the rhythmic hum of the engine filled the silence between muttered prayers and quiet sobs. The air inside was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, blood, and the sour stench of fear that radiated from the bound prisoners whose fates had already been decided. Gerard Deckard sat with his back straight, his wrists bound tightly behind his back with a tie that dug into his skin. Beside him, a young soldier, barely more than a boy, shook with barely suppressed terror, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought back sobs.
"Relax, lad. Breathe. Don't give them the satisfaction,"
Deckard said, his voice low, firm. The boy blinked at him, tears streaking the grime on his cheeks. Deckard held his gaze, unyielding.
"We're dead men walking, but we're still men. Make them see a soldier, not a coward."
The boy swallowed hard and nodded, reining in his sobs, though the tears that leaked from his eyes refused to stop. In such a tense situation, where there was no escape, Deckard fell back on his training. He closed his eyes and listened, trying to gauge where they were and where exactly they were going. Outside, he could hear the rest of the city and its residents as they went about their day, with little thought or concern for the condemned soldiers that were being transported within their midst. He heard the distant clang of forge hammers, the bark of merchants hawking wares, the drone of servitors carrying out various tasks, the scent of sizzling meat and machine oil. Children's laughter briefly rang out, only to be drowned out by the clank and squeal of the suspension as the transport raced down a badly pothole-pocked road. Abruptly, the transport lurched, the brakes groaning as it sharply slowed. Then, with a final shudder, it stopped. A heavy clang echoed through the tight confines of the transport as the rear doors were unlocked from the other side and wrenched open, spilling harsh daylight into the dim interior. The oppressive heat from outside slammed into them like a solid wall, searing and unrelenting. It was as if they had stepped too close to the roaring maw of an open furnace. The heat clung to their skin, thick and suffocating, filling their lungs with air that felt more like fire than breath. An indistinct figure stepped forward, to loom at the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding midday sun.
"Out!"
barked a gruff voice. The prisoners reluctantly obeyed. Boots hit the packed dirt, kicking up dust, as they jumped down from the transport one by one, under the watchful eyes of grim-faced armed guards, their las guns held at the ready with restless fingers on the triggers. They were on top of a squat flat hill with the city of Grawbank Secundus sprawling out all around them. A vast expanse of crumbling sun-baked stone and rockcrete buildings covered in a dusting of bright orange-colored sand. Imperial banners hung limp from the various fortifications and imposing bastions erected at regular intervals across the fortified city. Statues of military heroes stood in silent judgment at every crossroad and intersection as the teeming masses of civilian and military personnel went about their day below. Shimmering heat waves distorted the air as they rose up from the scorched city, giving the impression that the entire scene before them was not but a mirage. Squinting against the harsh light, Deckard took in his immediate surroundings. The top of the broad hill was a mustering ground of dry, cracked earth with empty bleachers arranged around the outside. Apparently, no one had come to watch their final moments. Deckard scoffed. He supposed they were nothing special, and their fate offered little in the way of spectacle. After all, this was routine. This was just imperial justice at work. A large wooden stage had been erected at the far end, with several nooses dangling from a long beam at its top. At the sight of the knotted pieces of rope, Deckard suddenly felt lightheaded and his stomach lurched. He fought for control and composed himself. Slowly, the convicts shuffled towards the gallows. As they drew closer, Deckard could make out figures moving in the thick shadows beneath the gallows. They were sun-darkened laborers in sweat-drenched clothes that were busy dragging away the slack-limbed bodies of those who had gone before. They dragged them from under the stage and pitched them into large waste bins for recycling. The shambling line of condemned prisoners were directed towards a narrow staircase that led to the top of the stage. Deckard ascended the wooden steps behind the boy he had tried to console in the transport, his boots scuffing against the worn planks. At the top, the nooses awaited, their fraying ropes swaying gently in the stifling breeze. Then the prisoners were manhandled into position. The nooses were slipped over their heads and pulled tight around their necks.
"Yeah, I know it's not comfortable, but look on the bright side,"
said the trooper in Astra Militarum uniform that secured the coarse noose around Deckard's neck.
"At least it won't be for long."
Then he chuckled to himself and backed away. A few of the other condemned prisoners started to sob and pray then, but Deckard refused. Instead, he clenched his jaw, forcing down the surge of panic that clawed at his throat. Fear was useless. Fear was what they wanted. Instead, he let his rage burn through the dread, gripping onto it like a lifeline. His fingers curled into fists behind his back, nails biting into his palms. He would not beg. He would not pray. Every day of his life had been a battle, and he'd meet death the same way he had met every battle, with defiance. An officer with a black sash across his uniform stepped forward, holding a rolled parchment in his hands.
"You have been arraigned here to answer for your crimes against the Imperium,"
the executioner said as he moved down the line, reciting their names and the crimes each one had been found guilty of with mechanical indifference: cowardice, dereliction of duty, desertion.
Gerard Deckard, former Sergeant of the Emperor's 101st Imperial Plasmas,
he intoned when he reached Deckard.
"Striking a superior officer."
Deckard forced a grin.
Yes, sir. And I'd do it again, sir.
A flicker of irritation crossed the executioner's face, gone as quickly as it came.
"The prisoners will remain silent."
Something struck Deckard from behind, and he let out a grunt of pain. The executioner carried on down the line until the officer reached the far side. Then he turned sharply, a boot slamming down on the wooden floor with a thunderous stomp.
"For such disgraceful conduct, there is but one punishment: death. May the Emperor have mercy on your wretched souls."
Despite his attempts to assert control, Deckard's heart pounded like a war drum, a relentless, deafening rhythm hammering against his ribs. He fought to steady his breath, to drown out the roar of his pulse in his ears, but failed. The officer gave a chopping motion. There was a pause. Another soldier next to a lever gave a nod. There was a heartbeat of silence. Then the lever was pulled. Deckard involuntarily gasped. There was a metallic clatter. Then the trapdoors all swung open. Bodies dropped, and Deckard fell with them. First, the sickening, sharp crack of breaking necks punctuated the air, followed by the grotesque, choked cries and struggling sounds of those less fortunate as they dangled at the end of the ropes. Legs kicked, twisting wildly as hands bound behind backs struggled against the inevitable with muted, gurgling gasps. Deckard's breath vanished as the rough fibers of the rope dug into his throat. Pressure mounted in his skull, veins pulsing like it would explode as darkness swelled at the edges of his vision. Flashes of light burst behind his eyes as white-hot streaks across a black void. It started with an almost imperceptible twang, inaudible over the commotion of the other convicts' death throes. It was followed by a loud, jarring snap as the rope above Deckard frayed and unraveled, the fibers giving way in a violent, stuttering tear as the rope of his noose snapped. For a single, breathless moment, he hung suspended in the air. Then Deckard fell once again. The air rushed past his skin, hot and stinging, his stomach lurching into his throat. The ground came up to meet him, fast, hard. The impact drove the breath from his lungs as pain exploded through his ribs as he vanished in a cloud of orange dust and sand. Dazed, he gasped and greedily sucked air into his burning lungs. Above him, the frayed and broken rope hung limply. Before his rattled mind could come to terms with what had happened, his training took over, and he was up and on his feet, his body practically moving of its own accord. Beyond the curtain of dust, the laborers stared at him confused, their eyes wide in shock, and for a moment he was as confused as they were. He should be dead. He heard the sounds of shouting on the gallows stage above, and realization struck Deckard like a thunderbolt. The execution had failed. He was alive. And this was his one and only chance to stay that way. Deckard hurled himself forward. His shoulder slammed into the nearest wide-eyed laborer, sending the man crashing into a wooden support beam with a sickening thud. With such force, the entire gallows structure shuddered from the impact. The second worker turned to flee, but in his panic, his foot caught on a corpse that hadn't been moved yet, and he tumbled hard onto the blood-stained ground. He rolled onto his back as Deckard raced toward him, his hand reaching inside his sweat-stained tunic and drawing out a small blade that he held out before him in trembling hands. He swiped wildly. But Deckard reflexively swayed back, the sharp point of the weapon missing him by less than an inch, before he moved in close and lashed out with his leg. His boot came down hard on the laborer's guts, and he grunted in pain, the knife clattering from his grasp. Deckard dove for it, twisting his bound hands beneath himself as his fingers rummaged for the blade in the dirt. Once he found it, he wasted no time in sawing through the tie that pinned his hands behind his back. With a snap, the bindings gave way, releasing his hands. Deckard brought the knife up in front of himself as he dropped into a combat stance, his muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. He fixed the laborers with a wild, burning glare and let out a low, war-hardened growl.
Rah!
At the sight of him, armed and dangerous, they scrambled to their feet and bolted away into the shadows. Loud, frantic shouts erupted from above. A guardsman peeked over the edge of the trapdoor looking for Deckard in the gloom, a las pistol clutched in his hand. Deckard dropped and rolled. A red bolt sizzled past his ear, striking the ground where he had been but a heartbeat before, scorching the sand black. They shot again and again. Deckard's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he righted himself and sprinted towards the bleachers that surrounded the hilltop so crowds could watch the high-profile executions. Reaching the first row, he dropped low, ducking beneath the seats and weaving through the tangle of wooden supports underneath. The frame rattled as he scrambled through, his hands scraping against splintered wood and exposed nails as he pushed himself forward. Then he burst out on the far side, the ground vanishing beneath him as the hill sloped down towards the city. With no time to stop and catch his breath, he threw his weight forward. He slid down the steep embankment in a cloud of orange sand and dust as he tumbled toward freedom. Shouts chased after him, as did the sounds of las rifle fire, as red bolts rained down around him. Deckard ducked behind the nearest building, pressing himself against the rough, hot stone as he sucked in a burning breath. His body ached, his lungs screamed for air, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not if he wanted to keep living. He darted into a narrow back street, his boots pounding against the uneven cobblestones. It opened up into a wide, open-air storage yard, a chaotic sprawl of stacked provisions and munitions. Enormous metal containers loomed over him, their surfaces marked with the imperial Aquila in red paint. Lumbering servitors moved among the stacks, their sun-baked skin cracked and leathery. They ignored him entirely as they continued to load and unload supplies with detached mechanical precision. Deckard ran amongst them, knocking aside smaller crates and sending loose supplies scattering across the ground in his haste. The servitors he sped past showed no emotion or concern for the mess he made as they continued with their tasks. Shouts rang out, closer now. He threw a glance over his shoulder and saw dark shapes moving fast through the back street. They were gaining on him. To make matters worse, a squad of troopers burst from a left turn just in front of him, cutting off his escape. Deckard cursed and pivoted hard to change direction. But his momentum caused him to veer off and almost collide with a servitor. At the last moment, he twisted his body, brushing past it as a volley of las fire shot towards him. The unfortunate servitor took the brunt of them. Searing beams punched into its torso, burning through flesh and superheated metal. The thing staggered, its mechanical limbs spasming violently, as organs were ruptured and internal circuits were fried. One arm, still clutching a heavy crate, convulsed before locking up. Then a final shot struck its skull, sending a red plume of evaporated brain tissue into the air. With a hollow, static-filled groan, the servitor collapsed. Its heavy frame careened into a stack of supply crates, toppling them over with a loud crash. Deckard darted into a narrow alley between two stacks of crates, twisting sideways to squeeze between two buildings, the tough stone walls scraping at the exposed skin of his forearms. Behind him, las fire slammed into the stone wall, sending shards of rock flying. Deckard realized that he couldn't outrun them. Not for long. Then he saw it. A sewer grate. Half sunken into the ground with rusted grime-covered bars was a hole into the waste tunnels below the city. Deckard didn't hesitate. He reached down and yanked at the grate covering, but it refused to budge. Footsteps thundered closer as angry shouts echoed down the alley he had escaped down. He gritted his teeth, planted his boots, and heaved. With a shrill shriek of metal, the grate was wrenched open. Deckard jumped and dropped into the darkness to land with a splash. The abominable stench hit first, a thick miasma of rot, waste, and stagnant water that seemed to stick to the inside of his throat and clogged up his burning lungs. The only light that filtered down into the tunnels came through the irregularly spaced sewer grates that were set into the ceiling, like the one he had jumped down through. They offered fleeting glimpses of the space ahead of him, like little islands of illumination separated by black voids of impenetrable blackness. Deckard forced himself to move forward and into the darkness. His boots splashed through the filth below as he sank up to his knees in the cold, foul-smelling, viscous liquid. Spurred on by the sound of shouting voices above, he began to wade through the muck as fast as he could, almost slipping and falling more than once. The tunnel split and he took a left, and then a right, and then a left again. He stopped and held his breath, listening for any signs he was still being followed. He heard nothing. Had he lost them? Had he actually escaped, he asked himself? Then something stung his neck. A sharp prick, like an insect bite, but much more painful. His hand shot up, his fingers grasping onto some kind of spiny dart. He pulled it out, but his vision had already started to blur, his body tip and sway. He heard loud chittering sounds from the darkness ahead of him, so he raised the knife towards it defensively. But as he did so, it slipped from his numb fingers to splash into the sewer water as he lost all sense of balance. The world spun and Deckard toppled forward, face first. Then, everything was darkness. Sometime later, consciousness sluggishly returned to Deckard, accompanied by a dull ache that throbbed at the base of his skull. He tried to move, but with the clinking of chains, cold metal bit into his wrists and ankles, and he realized he was restrained. A jolt of panic shot through him. They'd caught him after all. His eyes shot open, But rather than a barracks or a cell, he found himself somewhere totally unfamiliar. A dim, reddish glow illuminated a chamber of rough-hewn stone. Not cast by lumens, but by a bioluminescent fungi that clung to the damp ceiling in thick clumps. They gave off a pulsating light that cast long, shifting shadows. On the other side of the cave, slumped against the wall and similarly chained up, was another prisoner. A soldier, clad in the uniform and flak armor of the Astra Militarum, his head lolled forward as if unconscious. In the center of the room stood a crudely carved stone table, atop which was a clutter of various glass vials and bottles. Deckard could see that inside them, different colored liquids bubbled and steamed while a few radiated an eerie light. "Psst, psst," Deckard called. But the soldier neither moved or replied. Instead, the only response were chittering and clicking sounds that emanated from the shadows. Deckard stiffened.
"Ah, you are awake,"
came a strange voice. The words slithered across the chamber, thick with an unfamiliar accent, as if the speaker's tongue was swollen, their throat restricted. Then, from the darkness, the repulsive Xenos emerged. It was like something out of a nightmare. It scuttled into view on 6 spindly, multi-jointed legs with large, spiked, carapaced feet. It looked insect-like, but its bloated body was covered in something more like pale human skin and fine brown hairs. Rolls of cellulite and excess flesh hung from its flanks, and its belly was pockmarked with open sores. From the sores, tiny pink creatures would emerge, to skitter across its body only to burrow back into another of the open wounds. The thing that was its head was covered in a dozen black, soulless eyes that blinked independently as it regarded Deckard with interest, the mandibles of its mouth quivering in delight.
"You do not shout. You do not struggle,"
it observed.
"Good. It means you think."
Deckard swallowed down the bile rising in his throat. He had fought Xenos before and seen many horrors on the battlefield, but nothing like this, and he was completely at its mercy.
"If you're going to kill me, Xenos,"
he growled.
"then do it."
The creature's mandibles flexed, and its lipless maw curled, baring sharp, pointed teeth.
"Kill you? No. Your kind does that so easily. You are so wasteful."
It clicked.
"No, that is not our way. I had hoped we might converse. Your kind is stubborn, but I have questions, many questions, and you will listen."
Deckard rubbed his temples and forced himself to think. Everything had happened so fast. He thought he'd gotten away, but now he was who knows where, being held by who knows what, for a purpose he was afraid to even consider.
"What in the throne's name are you?"
He spat, trying to sound calm and in control.
"What do you want with me?"
The Xenos leaned in closer, its too many eyes unblinking as it looked him over. The small pink spider-like things on its body stirred, crawling up its elongated arms and nesting into the creases and folds of its wrinkled, sagging flesh.
"Good questions. Yes, good. Often my specimens just scream, or repeat ranks, or pray. But you are different, so I will answer,"
it said.
"I am one of the last. When your kind first arrived, we were excited, eager. We had waited so long to know that we were not alone in the universe."
It paused, tilting its head first one way, then the other. A rhythmic clicking sound followed, like the mechanical sound of a music box being wound too tight.
"We thought you brought friendship, but you brought fire and death. Too late we came to understand. You wanted our world, coveted it for your own. In a great purge, you washed us from the surface of our own world. But we did not all perish. Some hid in the deep forgotten places, and we waited. We watched. We learned."
Deckard had been taught about humanity's divine right to rule the stars, and how, during the Age of Strife, Xenos had attacked and enslaved much of mankind. So xenocide was a matter of justifiable self-defense. He was about to say as much when, with a groggy moan, the other prisoner began to speak.
"No, Don't listen to it.
He groaned.
An open mind is like a fortress with its gates unbarred and unguarded. The Emperor protects. Death to all Xenos.
The Xenos wheezed and exhaled slowly, a sound that might have been disappointment.
Ah, you are one of those.
It commented as the soldier began to thrash violently against his restraints. The Xenos turned away from Deckard and moved towards him, the movements of its long, pale limbs abnormal, like it was a giant, ghastly marionette. Deckard watched in horror as the Xenos reached the other chained man and extended a thin, trembling appendage towards him. As it did so, the little pink spider things that skittered across its body raced forward to drop down onto the soldier. He bucked and lashed out as they rained down and covered him. They crawled over his face and into his hair, finding their way under his clothes and burrowing beneath his armor. They wriggled into every crevice they could find, and then they began to feed. He screamed. He continued to thrash around, trying to dislodge them and shake them off, but it was no good. Bite by bite, they tore at his skin and flesh, his wild, pain-filled movements sending blood to spray and splatter in all directions. They tunneled their way into his flesh and began to rummage around as writhing bulges just beneath the blood-covered skin. Abruptly, he stopped screaming. He coughed and gagged violently, blood spraying from his lips as something wriggled inside his throat. Then his eyes bulged, his body seized, and he became deathly still. The Xenos watched the gruesome event, its inhuman black eyes betraying no emotion Deckard could discern.
We are not like you. We do not waste.
It affirmed, turning back to lock its many eyes on him once again.
You will assist me with information, or you will assist the young as sustenance.
Deckard, his breath coming in shallow gasps, yanked at his chains, testing their strength. They held fast. Sweat beaded his brow, his stomach twisted with nausea. He was trapped and helpless. He relented and collapsed with a sigh of resignation.
Good. You understand the situation.
The Xenos said.
I understand I have no choice.
He replied.
Then you understand perfectly.
The Xenos questioned Deckard for hours, all to the backdrop of the slurping, gnawing sounds of the small creatures feeding. He expected questions about troop deployments and the locations of weapons caches. But instead, the Xeno asked him seemingly random and irrelevant questions, such as, did Deckard have any siblings? Did he like chocolate? How many offspring did humans typically have? Did he have any allergies? At what age could human children fight? And had he been inoculated to defend against any local diseases? The barrage of unusual questions continued until, exhausted, Deckard hung limply in his restraints. His head lolled to the side and he looked over at the remains of the other prisoner. Where once a man had been, only bloodied ruin remained. The floor was sticky with a dark pool of thick, congealed blood, but every ounce of flesh, skin and organ had been completely consumed. Only bones, picked clean, jutted from the tattered remains of a shredded crimson-stained uniform that wrapped around a body that was no longer there. Most of the tiny creatures, plump after their large meal, had returned to the larger Xeno's body, nestling back into the open sores to sleep off their feast. But a few still scurried across the skeleton, ducking in and out of the empty eye sockets and hiding in the empty ribcage, as if they were playing a macabre game of tag with one another. Deckard's stomach twisted at the sight. He had seen death many times on the battlefield. He had seen men reduced to nothing but red mist by heavy bolter fire, burned to steaming stumps by promethium, and torn limb from limb by frenzied greenskins. But he had never watched a man vanish, slowly, piece by piece, mouthful by mouthful. It filled him with revulsion, and the flames of hatred burned brightly in Deckard's soul. This was why Xenos had to be purged from every corner of the galaxy. They were a filthy blight, an infestation that had to be eradicated.
Enough of this,
Deckard raged.
I will not betray my species. No more questions.
The Xenos loomed over him, its mandibles quivering.
Oh, you will tell me plenty, but perhaps not in the way you expect.
It said before shambling back towards the stone table with its bubbling glass bottles and vials, its black eyes gleaming in the red glow of the bioluminescent fungi.
We have learned much from your kind. Your bodies are unremarkable in their durability. It is your technology that grants you power. But should your bodies wither, your technological advantage becomes mute.
Deckard clenched his jaw.
If you want military secrets, I don't know any.
The Xenos made a clicking noise, and its body flexed.
The military caste of your kind see things so two-dimensionally. You expect an uprising, a straight confrontation, which is why we will strike from the shadows. Your kind will be dead before they know who attacked them, and this world will be ours once again.
A new sound filled the chamber, the dragging of something heavy across the stone floor. Two smaller insectoid creatures scuttled from the darkness and into the dim light of the chamber, hauling the limp form of another human on their backs. The new prisoner was a woman with short blonde hair, unconscious and wearing dirty laborer's overalls. As she was brought forward, the large Xenos kicked aside the remains of the eaten soldier, sending fragments of bone and flak armor to be thrown across the chamber. Reaching into the folds of the fatty flesh that hung from its flanks, the Xenos produced a key that it used to unlock the restraints. In her state, the woman could not resist as, with a twist of the key, she took the previous prisoner's place locked and shackled to the wall by the heavy iron manacles.
What did you do to her?
Deckard demanded.
You show concern? Interesting. Would you say you show greater concern than for the other one? Is it because this one is female, or is it because you saw the other one die?
The Xenos quizzed him.
I won't answer any more of your questions,
Deckard hissed.
Defiance. That may be useful in the test. As for this one, it is merely incapacitated, as you were when you were brought here. The result of a simple compound that induces a deep, dreamless slumber. Painless. A mercy, really, compared to what's next.
The Xenos shambled back to the table and began to mix chemicals from the various vials together in its pincered hands.
Your kind are such fragile things,
it mused.
It's a wonder your species survived long enough to develop technology. Our own bodies are more resilient, superior. You may not want to indulge my questions any longer, but your physique will tell me everything I really need to know.
The Xenos selected 2 bottles, one filled with a thick, inky substance, the other with a pale, bubbling fluid. It mixed them together in a large vial, and the reaction was immediate. The mixture hissed and popped, giving off a sickly, yellow glow and a stench like sulfur that filled the chamber.
So you will help us, willingly or otherwise,
it said, as it approached Deckard with the vial outstretched before it.
What hurts you is harmless to us, and with just a bit more experimentation, you will show us the way to eradicate you once and for all from our world.
Deckard pulled against his restraints, muscles straining, but the iron chains held firm. The Xenos rose up above him, and from the vial tipped a single drop of the yellow glowing fluid that landed on the exposed skin of his forearm. It felt cold at first. Then the pain came. It spread like fire beneath his skin, boiling his blood, twisting his nerves into searing wires of the most intense agony. His muscles contracted and locked, squeezing the air from his lungs, and he couldn't breathe as he was rocked by powerful spasms. The Xenos leaned over him, its dozens of black, inhuman eyes drinking in his struggle. Then the hallucinations began. The walls warped, turning into writhing masses of flesh covered in tiny black eyes and hungry mouths that snapped towards him, trying to eat him alive. Then the dark shadows coalesced into figures he knew. They were his comrades, the ones that had been sent to their deaths by the orders of a cowardly officer that cared more for status and personal glory than the lives of his men. Deckard had punched the incompetent officer's teeth out, but it wasn't enough. He should have killed him. He should have throttled him to death with his bare hands. A scream shattered Deckard's madness. He forced his vision to focus towards the howling sound. It was coming from the other prisoner that was chained to the wall, just as he was. In his chaotic, kaleidoscopic vision, he saw the Xenos had pressed something to her face, a cloth laced with the same glowing yellow fluid that had been dripped on his arm. The woman convulsed, her body seizing with back-breaking force. A guttural, gurgling scream tore from her throat that came to an abrupt, strangled end as something bubbled up from deep inside her that caused her to gag. She continued to spasm, harder and harder, causing her joints to crack and pop with each wrenching movement. Her veins bulged beneath her skin, darkening into black and purple branching lines that were clearly visible under the skin. Then came the bleeding. Her nose erupted first, a thick, viscous stream running down her chin in pulsing surges. Then from her eyes as crimson tears streaked down her cheeks. She began to claw at her throat with her own fingers, her nails tearing open deep furrows of flesh in a desperate attempt to stop whatever horror was happening inside her. Then she doubled over as she vomited forth a torrent of blood, spittle, and vomit. Finally, she collapsed forward and became still, silent, dead. The Xenos watched intently, making a clicking sound of approval at her grisly fate. Deckard's last thoughts were ones of rage and revenge, as he slipped into unconsciousness yet again. When he did drift back into awareness, he had no idea how much time had passed. His head throbbed, his joints hurt as if they were aflame, and there was a bitter, acrid taste on his tongue. His cheek was pressed against the uneven stone floor of the cavern, half submerged in the large puddle of his own vomit in which he lay. Apparently, whatever grueling stress had racked his body had loosened his bowels, and a warm dampness clung to the fabric of his crotch. But the anger and hunger for revenge still burned within him, tempered now into a cold, calculating resolve. He would make the Xenos pay. He remained still and forced himself to breathe slow and shallow. Slowly, he opened his eyes, just enough to see without giving away the fact that he was awake. The Xenos leaned over the remains of the woman. It was using its elongated pincers to pick and prod at her blooded cadaver. It chittered softly, mandibles quivering as it worked. Deckard remained still. Didn't so much as twitch, though his muscles screamed for relief, to move and stretch, but he knew better. If the Xenos suspected he was awake, it would come for him next. He needed to ready himself first. Through squinted eyes, he spotted something nearby in the red glow of the moss, a bone. It must have belonged to the soldier that had been devoured, likely discarded by the Xenos' careless kick and sent tumbling to his side of the cave. It was large, perhaps a femur or humerus. Deckard couldn't say, he was no medicae. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the splintered end where it had been gnawed and broken into a sharp, wicked point. It was something he could use. A weapon. Slowly, painfully slowly, he moved his arm and stretched out his fingers towards it. His limbs trembled from dehydration and abuse, but the thought of vengeance fortified his will. Touching it with his fingertips, he pulled it back towards himself. The bone scraped against the stone with the faintest of sounds. Almost there, Deckard thought. When it was close enough, he curled his fingers around it and drew it in, concealing it beneath his body. It felt sticky with dried viscera, and the tip was just as sharp as he had hoped. In his mind, Deckard offered up a silent prayer to the Emperor for this chance for retribution. Then he closed his eyes and waited for an opportunity to strike. Eventually, the Xenos turned. its many black eyes locking onto the prone form of Deckard on the floor. Noisily, it lumbered towards him. Deckard forced himself to remain limp and still.
Human, are you still alive?
It asked. It reached down and gently poked at him with a pincered hand before rolling him onto his back. At the sight of Deckard's shallow breathing, it began to click and chitter.
It seems I underestimated you. How fascinating,
it said. Deckard's eyes shot open and he surged upwards, gripping the bone spike in both hands and driving it into the Xenos thing's neck with a squirt of black ichor. The Xenos let out a gurgled screech. Deckard tore the makeshift weapon free and stabbed again and again and again. Thick, oily residue squirted from its body, drenching him, but he didn't stop. It tried to back away, but Deckard seized it by the mandible, yanked it forward, and buried the bone weapon deep into its flat, insectoid face. The Xeno stopped struggling, its many legs spasming before it collapsed into a twitching mess at Deckard's feet. Panting, Deckard wasted no time. He dropped to his knees and plunged his hands into the creature's bloated, fleshy flank. The folds of skin were warm, slick with mucus, and gave off a stomach-churning smell. His fingers groped and searched, pushing through layers of gelatinous fat and sinew, searching for the key he had seen it removed from there. Something bit into the flesh of his wrist, sending a jolt of pain up his arm. It was one of the tiny spider-like Xenos larvae. Deckard reached in with his other hand, ripped it from his arm, and threw it to the ground, before bringing his foot down on it and feeling its exoskeleton crack beneath his boot. Then his fingers found something solid in the flabby folds of the dead Xeno. It was the key. He pulled it free, ignoring the sticky mucus that coated his hands as he worked at the lock of the shackles that kept him chained up. The metal was rusted, ancient, but the key turned with a satisfying click before releasing him. He was free at last. Deckard rose to his feet, retrieved the bone weapon, and cast the Xeno corpse one last hateful glare before, with a kick farewell, he staggered towards the shadows that led outside of the chamber. Blindly, he edged forward with outstretched hands until he found himself in a long corridor lit with the familiar red glowing moss. Like the chamber, it was hewn from rock and dirt, and cautiously Deckard made his way along it. Then the tunnel opened up into a massive underground cavern, a sprawling hive of skittering Xenos, laboring over great churning vats and siphoning a yellow glowing fluid to fill enormous glass cylinders. It was the same lethal liquid he'd seen demonstrated back in the cave. But this wasn't for testing. This was chemical weapon production on an industrial scale. It was a factory of death, right below the unsuspecting city. Deckard kept to the shadows and slinked past, slipping down the nearest exit and into another corridor. Suspended from the ceiling and hung on the walls were half-dissolved corpses that twitched inside fleshy cocoons. Some still had faces, their mouths frozen in rictus silent screams, while the flesh of others had rotten to slurry. Over their bodies roamed the familiar small spider creatures, swarming, feasting. A shudder ran through Deckard. He had to get out. He broke into a run. Then a lone Xeno stepped into his path. Deckard didn't break stride. Instead, he leapt into the air, landing on its back and driving the bone spike into its body. He stabbed it over and over until it collapsed beneath him with a wet, choking sound. Deckard didn't stick around to make sure it was dead. Instead, he continued to run on, leaving it behind. The air changed and carried an unpleasant but familiar scent. It was a thick miasma of rot, waste, and stagnant water. It was the sewers he had jumped into in his attempt to escape being lynched. He pushed forward, lungs burning, rounded a corner, and, sure enough, the rough-hewn rock gave way to a rock-crete tunnel filled with ankle-deep refuse and sewage. Deckard charged into the tunnel. He'd never been so overjoyed at the prospect of wading through raw human sewage, but overjoyed he was as his boots splashed through the foul water, sending ripples that echoed out to disappear into the darkness. He continued on until he reached a ladder bolted onto a wall that led up to an access panel in the ceiling. He lunged for it, fingers slipping on the rusted rungs as he scrambled upwards. At the top, he pressed his palm against the cold metal cover and pushed. At first, it refused to budge. His muscles screamed with the strain. But fueled by pure desperation, with a groan, it gave way and swung open to reveal the sun-baked city above. Deckard hauled himself up and rolled onto the hot, dust-covered ground and lay there for a moment, trying to catch his breath. When his eyes had adjusted to the brightness above ground, he realized he was in a narrow side street, flanked by squat stone buildings on either side. Slowly, he eased himself into a sitting position and, with careful consideration, estimated he was somewhere near the outskirts of the city. Just a little further were the great orange sand dunes, and beyond that were the smaller townships and trading posts, where he could disappear from the authorities for good. Deckard rose to his feet and dusted himself off. Cautiously, he made his way to the end of the street, where it joined a bustling road filled with people. He peeked his head around the corner and weighed his options. To his left, he saw a checkpoint manned by armed soldiers in the combat armor of the Astra Militarum. Behind them was a towering steel gate topped with razor wire that separated this outer district from the heart of the city. To the right was a crumbling archway built into the high fortified rockcrete walls that ran around the city's perimeter. If he wanted to live, the choice was simple. Deckard tossed aside the ichor-covered bone weapon and, ducking down his head, merged with the flow of people trudging toward the archway. They were workers, migrants, traders, and beggars. A few muttered in hushed tones and covered their noses when he drew too close. He didn't blame them. After everything he'd been through, he must have reeked. A laughing child jostled into him and he stopped. Around Deckard, he saw a man guiding his elderly mother by the arm, and a dark-haired woman carrying a sleeping baby wrapped in cloth against her shoulder. His breath hitched. He looked at all the faces of the people that walked by, their tired, hollow eyes. Then he thought of the Xenos and their toxic chemicals. These people have no idea what's coming, Deckard thought. For a fleeting moment, he tried to shut it out, to convince himself it wasn't his problem. He took several more steps before he stopped again. He clenched his jaw as he pictured, in his mind, what they'd all look like, spasming, bleeding, dying. If he walked through that archway, if he vanished into the wasteland, he would live, but everyone here would surely die. This was bigger than him, Deckard decided. He exhaled sharply, a growl of frustration bubbling in his throat.
By the Emperor's bloody throne,
he cursed. Then he turned, shoving his way through the crowd, fighting his way against the flow of people, and back toward the checkpoint he had seen. He had to tell someone, warn them. Who knows? They might even give him a pardon. As Deckard approached the checkpoint, his legs felt weak, and he started to question if this was a good idea after all. He raised both his hands in the air, palms open in a gesture of submission.
Wait! Please listen to me! I have something to say. I need to warn you!
He called out, his voice strained. The response from the checkpoint guards was immediate. Las rifles snapped up in unison, aiming right at him as someone he couldn't see started to bark out orders. The air filled with panicked screams and shouts as startled civilians scattered, fleeing into side streets or ducking into cover. Deckard stood his ground.
In the sewers! Xenos! They're preparing an attack!
Deckard shouted, trying to be heard over the commotion.
I can show you! I can...
The first lasbolt hit him square in the chest, the impact sending a shockwave of heat and pain through his ribs, as it seared its way deep into his body. The second lanced through his throat, blasting off chunks of him to splatter the crowd that hadn't managed to get far enough away, and the final shot struck his forehead. Deckard's body crumpled instantly, collapsing to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. A tense silence settled over the checkpoint. A few of the guardsmen rushed from their positions behind barricades and began prodding at Deckard's body with the barrels of their rifles.
Clear!
One of them called out. An officer approached. He flipped through a binder of briefing reports, stopping to squint at the picked capture of an unkempt, rough-looking guardsman on the shoot-on-sight list. He looked back and forth between the document and the body in front of him several times. It was hard to make a confident match with the document's grainy photo, given that the corpse had a fresh hole where its face used to be.
Well, it kind of looks like him,
the officer muttered, wrinkling his nose.
Why'd you idiots shoot him in the face? Makes my job a real pain.
It was him, sir.
One of the troopers, young, freckled with short ginger hair, insisted, her hands still clenched around her rifle, knuckles white.
I know it was him.
The officer sighed, glancing down at the bloodied corpse. He gave it a light kick, as if that would somehow confirm its identity.
Yeah, all right. Bag him up. We'll get someone to take a look at him back at HQ.
He turned and fixed the young trooper with a hard glare.
If this isn't him, Jenkins, you and your squad will be on latrine duty for a long time.
It's him, sir, I swear. You'll see.
The soldiers callously grabbed Deckard's limp body by the feet and, unceremoniously, dragged him back toward the checkpoint, smearing a long crimson trail across the dust and sand. Across the rest of the city, life carried on as usual. Men, women, and children went about their day, blissfully ignorant of the Xenos that labored tirelessly beneath their feet to kill them all.